pulled 10 of the most viewed physics claims currently going around TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Then I did the boring thing nobody clipped for the algorithm. I opened the actual source behind each one. Here's the promise. By the end, you'll know exactly which of these are false, which are true, and this is the part most fact-check videos skip, which one is still a genuinely open argument between physicists right now, not a settled score. Most I fact-check this videos do one of two things badly. They either say false with zero citation, which is just a confident guess wearing a lab coat, or they flatten every claim into false, because science, without admitting when the real answer is true, but not for the reason you think, or actually still debated. I'm doing neither. Every verdict below has a name, a year, and a place you can go check it yourself. Claim 1. Quantum entanglement lets you send messages instantly, faster than light. Verdict. False. This is probably the single most repeated physics claim on the internet, and it's wrong in a specific, teachable way. Entangled particles do show real, instant correlations when measured. That part is true and genuinely strange. But there's a formal result called the no communication theorem, not one single Eureka paper, but a result that emerged through the 1970s to 1990s as quantum measurement theory got formalized, closely tied to work by physicists like Asher Perez, and it proves you cannot use those correlations to send a chosen message. Here's why. In plain terms, when you measure your half of an entangled pair, you get a random result, heads or tails, so to speak, and so does your partner on their end. Your results are correlated with theirs, but neither of you can control which random result you personally get. Without the ability to control the outcome, there's no way to encode a 0 or a 1 you chose. The only way to even confirm the correlation existed is to compare notes afterward over an ordinary speed-of-light phone call or message. No faster-than-light channel exists here, and this isn't a technology we haven't built yet. It's a mathematical proof, baked into quantum mechanics itself, that this specific use is impossible. Real physics, badly retold on TikTok as a loophole around Einstein. Claim 2. A penny dropped from a skyscraper can kill someone on the street. Verdict. False. This one is pure, testable physics, and it's been tested. A falling penny reaches its terminal velocity, the speed where air resistance pushing up exactly balances gravity pulling down after falling only about 15 meters or 50 feet. After that, no matter how much farther it falls, it doesn't speed up further. Its terminal velocity works out to around 40 kilometers per hour or 25 miles per hour, about jogging into a brisk throw speed, not bullet speed. Researchers have actually fired pennies at that exact terminal velocity into ballistic gel and a real human skull replica. No penetration. A tumbling 1-gram coin at 25 miles an hour stings. It does not kill. The myth assumes gravity keeps accelerating an object all the way down with nothing pushing back, which would be true in a vacuum and completely false in Earth's actual atmosphere. Claim 3. There's zero gravity in space. That's why astronauts float. Verdict. Misleading, not false, not quite true. This is the one I most wanted to include, because the correction people usually give is itself a little too simple. Gravity on the International Space Station is roughly 90% as strong as gravity at Earth's surface. It has barely dropped at all. Since the ISS orbits only a few hundred kilometers up, a small distance compared to Earth's radius. So it is flatly wrong to say there's no gravity up there. What's actually happening is that the ISS, and everyone inside it, is in continuous free fall toward Earth. It's just moving sideways so fast, about 28,000 kilometers per hour, or 17,500 miles per hour, that it falls around the curve of the planet instead of straight into it. Astronauts float because they and the station are falling together at the same rate, not because gravity switched off. NASA's own materials are explicit that zero gravity is a misleading nickname for what's really called microgravity. Claim 4. Heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Verdict. False. In a vacuum, Apollo 15, 1971. Galileo argued against this over 400 years ago, but the most dramatic proof happened on the moon. In 1971, Apollo 15 commander David Scott dropped a 1.32 kilogram, or 2.9 pound, geology hammer and a 0.03 kilogram, about 1 ounce, falcon feather from the same height at the same instant, live on camera. On Earth, air resistance would slow the feather dramatically, and it would look like heavy objects win. On the airless moon, with no atmosphere to push back differently on the two shapes, both objects hit the lunar surface at exactly the same moment. Mass doesn't determine falling speed under gravity alone. Air resistance, which depends on shape and surface area, is the entire reason heavy and light objects ever appear to fall differently here on Earth. Claim 5. Glass is a slow-moving liquid. That's why old cathedral windows are thicker at the bottom. Verdict: false. Glass is technically an amorphous solid. Its atoms are arranged without the tidy repeating pattern of a crystal, but they are not flowing like a liquid. Materials scientists have actually calculated how long it would take ordinary window glass to visibly flow at room temperature, something on the order of 10 to the 23rd years, roughly 1 trillion times the current age of the universe. The real explanation for old, unevenly thick windows is far less mystical. Medieval glassblowers made panes by spinning or flattening blown glass cylinders, which came out naturally uneven, and installers often placed the thicker, heavier edge at the bottom for stability. It's a manufacturing artifact from centuries ago, not glass caught mid-flow. Claim 6. You can't hear sound in space. Verdict: true, with a fascinating asterisk. Finally, one that's actually correct. Mostly. Sound is a mechanical wave. It needs particles of a medium, like air, bumping into each other to propagate. In the vacuum of space, with essentially no air, ordinary sound waves have nothing to travel through, which is exactly why astronauts communicate by radio, not by shouting. Here's the asterisk. And it's recent, genuine physics, not a gotcha. A 2023 paper in Communications Physics, complete tunneling of acoustic waves between piezoelectric crystals, showed that in very specific lab setups, using piezoelectric crystals separated by an extremely small vacuum gap, sound vibrations can tunnel across the gap by converting into an oscillating electric field and back again. It only works across a distance smaller than the sound wave's own wavelength, and it has no practical use for, say, hearing someone yell in orbit. So, the TikTok claim is basically right for any situation you'd actually encounter, and physics still found one narrow, delightful exception at the edges. Claim 7. Nuclear power plants can explode like an atomic bomb. Verdict: false. This confuses two very differently engineered things. Weapons-grade uranium is enriched to roughly 90% or higher of the fissile isotope. Commercial reactor fuel is enriched to only about 4 to 5%. That difference isn't cosmetic, it's the difference between fuel that can sustain the extremely fast, uncontrolled chain reaction a bomb needs and fuel that physically cannot, no matter how badly a reactor accident goes. Reactor fuel is also spread through the core rather than compressed into the bomb's precise geometry, and reactors are built with control rods specifically to slow the reaction down, not speed it up. Real nuclear accidents are genuinely serious steam explosions, meltdowns, radioactive release. But the physics of a nuclear weapon detonation and the physics of a reactor accident are simply not the same category of event. Claim 8. A powerful enough magnet, like in an MRI machine, could stop your heart or wipe your memory. Verdict: false. But MRI magnets have real, different risks. Clinical MRI scanners typically run at 1.5 to 3 Tesla. Compare that to Earth's own magnetic field, which is about 0.00005 Tesla, or a scrapyard magnet strong enough to lift a car, around 1 Tesla. The FDA classifies MRI scanners up to 8 Tesla as posing no significant health risk, and no study has reported a serious cardiac event caused by exposure to a standard 3 Tesla clinical scanner. Your heart's electrical signals and your memories aren't stored as loose magnetic charges that a strong field can just erase. Biology doesn't work that way. The real, well-documented MRI risks are completely different and much less dramatic sounding. The projectile effect, where loose metal objects get violently pulled toward the magnet, tissue heating, and nerve stimulation, genuine hazards, just not the ones going viral. Claim 9. 5G and cell phone radiation causes cancer. Verdict: false. The dividing line in physics here is ionizing versus non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, ultraviolet light, carries enough energy per photon to knock electrons loose and break chemical bonds in your DNA, which is how it can cause cancer. Radio waves, including 5G frequencies, are non-ionizing. Each photon simply doesn't carry enough energy to do that, full stop, regardless of how many of them hit you. For comparison, radio frequency photons carry far less energy than the visible light already hitting your eyes constantly if that class of radiation caused cancer. Ordinary daylight would be a bigger public health emergency than any phone network. The World Health Organization and the National Cancer Institute both state there's no conclusive evidence linking non-ionizing radiation from phones or 5G towers to cancer. Claim 10. Hot water freezes faster than cold water, the Mpemba effect, and it's settled science. Verdict. Genuinely disputed the honest answer, not a clean one. I'm ending on this one on purpose, because it's the one where confident TikTok certainty in either direction is the actual misinformation. The Mpemba effect, the observation that, under some conditions, initially hotter water can reach freezing before initially cooler water, is named for a Tanzanian student, Erasto Mpemba, who reported it in the 1960s, though people had noted the oddity long before. In 2016, researchers Burridge and Linden published a widely discussed paper arguing that once you control carefully for where you place your thermometer and the size of your container, the effect mostly vanishes. Their conclusion was that it isn't observable in any meaningful, reliable way. But that isn't the end of the story. More recent work by other physicists has found conditions under which a real, repeatable effect does appear, tied to details of convection and how heat escapes the container. As of today, this is a live, ongoing argument inside physics, not a closed case in either direction. And any video that tells you with total confidence, yes, it's real, or no, it's a myth, is skipping the actual state of the research to sound more certain than the 5 evidence allows. Here's the pattern across all 10. It's never science says versus TikTok says. It's always, what does the specific, named, dated source actually show, and does the claim survive contact with it? 6 of these 10 were flatly false. 1 was true, almost exactly as stated. 2 were technically true, but built on a misleading foundation. And the one most fact-check channels would have forced into a tidy yes or no, is honestly still being argued out in physics journals right now. Next time a physics claim crosses your feed with total confidence in either direction, ask one question. Does this video show me where the claim comes from? Specifically enough that I could go check it myself? Not studies show. Not scientists say. A name, a year, an institution, a place to look. If a video can't answer that in the first 30 seconds, that's your signal, regardless of which direction the claim points. The internet didn't invent bad physics claims. Cathedral tour guides have been telling the glass is a liquid story for 100 years. What's new is the speed. A confident 15-second claim can reach 10 million people before a single source gets checked. The fix was never, don't believe anything. It's, believe the thing you can trace. And every single verdict in this video was something you could trace yourself. Tonight, in under 5 minutes. Which of these 10 surprised you the most? The ones I called false, or the one I refused to call either way? Tell me the number, 1 to 10. In the comments, no wrong answer. If you want claims checked at the source, every time, that's what the Physics Storyteller exists to do. Subscribe to the Physics Storyteller and stop guessing which viral claim to trust. Next up on this channel, we go back to basics and ask why salt doesn't actually melt ice at all, a claim that's on literally every bag of rock salt sold in winter. That's coming up on the Physics Storyteller. 10 claims, 10 receipts, 1 honest, we don't fully know yet. That's the difference between a fact check and a guess wearing a lab coat.